There was an era when the name John D. Rockefeller made just about anyone shudder. He wasn't only the world's first billionaire, he also stands as one of the wealthiest individuals in all of history. His empire, Standard Oil, became the most unstoppable monopoly the world had ever seen, built by viciously destroying rivals, seizing control of multiple industries, bribing the government into obedience, and treating commerce like outright warfare. Thanks to his cutthroat tactics and hidden dealings, Rockefeller collected many enemies. His career is packed with intense rivalries, like the one with Andrew Carnegie, and even all-out battles against U.S. presidents. But before he became the giant of the oil world, Rockefeller started at the very bottom of society. His journey is one of just a handful of stories where someone climbs from extreme poverty all the way to the highest peak of riches and influence. Rockefeller's tale is sometimes uplifting and sometimes disturbing. It's a portrait of what happens when greed and ambition are left completely unrestrained. So let's go back to 1839, when a young John D. Rockefeller is born into destitution. In 1839, John D. Rockefeller arrived as the first child in a family of poor peasant farmers with no cash to spare. In his tiny town of fewer than 1,000 people, the most puzzling figure was undoubtedly John's father, nicknamed Devil Bill. Rather than helping on the family farm, Bill did practically everything else. He was an athlete, ventriloquist, hunter, hypnotist, and even an animal trainer. Once, he won a bear in a contest, kept it as a pet, and taught it tricks. Bill dabbled in this and that, but never stuck to much of anything. He would also randomly vanish in the middle of the night, leaving John and his siblings to survive on their own for weeks or months, only to reappear in a fancy carriage and shower them with toys and presents. This confused John, because his family lived in a crumbling old house, wore ragged clothes, and went to bed hungry and cold every night. They led a miserable existence, punctuated by brief bursts of luxury when his father came back. The reason was that Bill led a hidden double life as a con artist. Whenever he disappeared, Bill changed his name from William Rockefeller to Dr. William Livingston and traveled from town to town peddling useless herbal remedies and potions to the sick and desperate. Since Bill was usually far away running scams, John's mother relied on him to work on the farm, where she instilled in him a strong religious faith and a deep sense of duty as they plowed the fields. For a boy under 10, balancing school and farm work was exhausting, but it taught him the value of discipline and hard effort. John felt proud to help his family. In fact, he even started finding other ways to earn money. For example, John once followed a wild turkey into the woods, stole its eggs, and raised the chicks. When they grew into adult turkeys, John sold some for a nice profit and kept the rest to get more eggs and repeat the cycle. Even at such a young age, John was now bringing in a few dollars each week, making a real difference in the family's finances. It seemed the Rockefellers might finally enjoy a decent, stable life. However, when John was 10, his father Bill was accused of assaulting a young woman sexually. Even though nothing was proven, the Rockefellers still faced public shame, so they were forced to pack up and find a new home. You'd think after this that Bill would scale back his schemes, his cheating, and focus on healing his relationship with his family. But instead, he did the complete opposite. While using his fake identity of Dr. William Livingston, Bill married another woman in a different state where nobody recognized him. Of course, he kept it a secret, and neither John's mother nor the other woman ever knew he had two wives. But the effect was clear. Bill was almost never home. So the Rockefellers moved from town to town, and John took on more responsibility as the unofficial head of the household. All while going to school, he kept finding ways to make money, manage the family's finances, and even started giving out very small loans. Finally, the Rockefellers found a good home in Cleveland, Ohio. But now that John was 16 and nearly finished with school, he wondered what would come next. John wanted to go to college, but by then he had 4 siblings, with a 5th on the way. And since John's father was even more absent than usual now that he had his secret second wife, John's mother depended on John to help pay for their food, housing, and education. That meant college was out of the question. John had to start working immediately. So just 2 months before graduation, John dropped out of school and began hunting for a job in Cleveland. He wanted something big, so he made a list of all the largest railroads, banks, and wholesale merchants in the city. However, every time John showed up for an interview, people laughed in his face when they learned he was only 16 years old. John faced rejection after rejection, but no amount of humiliation would stop him, and after 6 long weeks, he landed an interview at a small firm that needed bookkeeping help. When they saw John's excellent handwriting, they decided to give him a chance and told him to start right away, not even mentioning what his pay would be. John was overjoyed, and for the rest of his life, he celebrated September 26th as a personal holiday he called Job Day. To him, it was even more important than his birthday. Even though it wasn't a huge operation, John's first job taught him how to deal with suppliers, pay bills, and see the inner workings of a real business for the first time. One day, his boss came in with a check for $4,000 and put it in a safe. John knew the safe's combination, so when his boss was gone, he opened it just to hold the note in his hands, mesmerized by how much it represented. John dreamed of someday earning as much as his bosses, so every morning before heading to work, he began repeating to himself, "I am bound to be rich." On the last day of 1855, John's bosses gave him his payment, $50, which meant he'd earned only a little over 50 cents a day. It wasn't much, but because he'd done such a good job, his bosses raised his salary to $300 per year, the equivalent of around $11,000 today. The raise gave John something he deeply wanted, independence from his father. Now, with his mother's help, he could finally give his family the stable life they had longed for. And from early in his career, John personally gave about 10% of his salary to various charities. But after 2 years of diligent work, a recession slowed the business, and one of the founders left the firm. All of his responsibilities fell onto John, who became the company's lead accountant. However, John knew the economic downturn had caused a sharp drop in the firm's revenues, and he suspected that soon the firm might have to shut down completely. And yet, John wasn't worried. His 2 years of experience had given him a huge amount of confidence, and so John was already planning his biggest move yet. John D. Rockefeller was ready to start his own company. During his first job, John had become friends with Maurice Clark, a 28-year-old chemist who worked down the street from him. Even though John was just 18 at this point, he built a good reputation as a bookkeeper in Cleveland, and one day Maurice told him he was planning to start a produce business and suggested they become partners. After saving up some money, they formed Clark and Rockefeller and got to work buying and reselling grain, fish, beans, meat, and other foods. It was tough at first. John and Maurice were often exhausted from seeking out customers on the road, but owning their own business gave them immense pride. And even though he was a bit shy and quiet at first, John was a capable salesman. Because he was so mature, everyone called him Mr. Rockefeller. The older men in the industry easily trusted him, and the list of clients for Clark and Rockefeller quickly grew. In fact, their biggest problem was that they didn't have the capital needed to expand the business and handle even more clients. But John and Maurice found a clever way to solve this. If they wanted a $5,000 loan, they would go around Cleveland saying their firm was looking to invest $10,000, very publicly giving the impression that they had plenty of cash. This simple trick made banks more willing to lend them money, and the extra loans they got put them in a great position when the American Civil War broke out, as business picked up even more. As a devout Baptist, John was strongly against slavery, so he wanted the Union to win the war. However, John was still responsible for feeding his family of 6, and if he stopped working, they'd have no income. So instead of serving in the army himself, John paid $300 for a substitute and even paid to equip several more Union soldiers. The war gave a huge boost to the northern states' economy, and Cleveland became an important strategic location for the Union. Local food prices were massively inflated, so John's produce business nearly quadrupled overnight. In 1862, John and Maurice cleared a profit of $17,000, over $500,000 in today's money. Not bad for a 23-year-old, but an opportunity to multiply his wealth even more soon crossed John's desk. You see, before electricity, people lit their homes at night by burning oil in a lamp. Usually, that oil came from whale fat, but finding and hunting whales was costly and difficult, and sadly, some whales had been hunted nearly to extinction. However, in 1859, someone in Pennsylvania discovered that by using a tall wooden structure called an oil derrick, you could extract industrial amounts of crude oil by drilling straight into the ground. Mining crude oil this way was cheap and fairly easy. Profits came quickly, and since so many people got rich from the oil boom, crude oil was nicknamed black gold. And that's when John was introduced to Samuel Andrews, a young man looking for investors to build a crude oil refinery in Cleveland, which was only a day's ride from the Pennsylvania oil regions. Andrews had a huge advantage over most competitors. He discovered that if you applied sulfuric acid to crude oil, it would purify it and turn it into kerosene. When burned, kerosene lasted longer and shone brighter than crude oil. It was a simple process, but the secret was closely guarded by the few who had discovered it. Now that John and Maurice had plenty of money to spare from their successful produce business, they thought it wise to diversify, so they loaned Andrews $4,000 to set up his oil refinery. But at first, they only considered this a side venture. John and Maurice kept running their produce business and let Andrews handle the refinery alone. Setting it up was remarkably simple, and because kerosene was a superior product to crude oil, it began selling like crazy. John couldn't ignore the numbers anymore. Within only a year, the oil refinery had become the most profitable part of the business. Together, John and Maurice made a bold move. They abandoned their previous business and went all in on the oil industry. However, their initial excitement was met with a massive challenge. The supply of oil was always unpredictable. At this point, oil had only been found in one small region of Pennsylvania, so many people thought it would eventually run out. Whenever someone struck a massive oil field, a whole town of oil miners would suddenly form around the site, drill every last drop, and then the town would vanish just as quickly as it had appeared. Because of this, there were periods when oil was overabundant and prices would drop as low as 10 cents. But on the flip side, if it seemed like oil was running out, prices would suddenly shoot up to $14. So to say the oil market was volatile would be an understatement. To reduce this effect slightly, John decided to stay out of mining oil and focus only on refining it. But for John and Maurice, the situation was still extremely stressful. When oil was easy to find, they weren't profitable because prices were low, and when wells were drying up, they feared the last drop had finally been found and they'd soon have nothing to sell. The uncertainty was too much for Maurice, and in 1865, he agreed to sell his share of the business to John. This was the turning point of his career. Scared to his core, but with a calm exterior, John agreed to buy Maurice's share for $72,500, $1.35 million in today's money. Maurice was cashing out, while John was doubling down and going all in on the seemingly risky oil business. However, it seemed John's daily affirmation that he was bound to be rich was quickly becoming true, because just as the deal was going down, a gigantic new oil field was found in the Pennsylvania oil regions, finally erasing any doubts he had about oil running out. Of course, the market was still very competitive, so if John truly wanted to become as wealthy as he desired, he would have to brutally crush his competition. The year before buying his business partner's share, John married a woman who shared his religious devotion. Even though he was now making good money, John bought a modest house in Cleveland, where they began to raise a family. So with his home life in order and the northern economy booming after the Union Army won the Civil War, everything was ready for John to begin building his empire. Now that his partner was gone, John rebranded the company under a new name, Standard Oil, and he got to work building his second refinery and began exporting kerosene to Europe. John was confident the oil industry would make him extremely rich, but it quickly became clear he needed some help. So John took on a new partner to help run the company, a man named Henry Flagler, and the two men were remarkably similar. Like John, Henry wasn't interested in making a little money. He wanted to build an empire. That's why when John told him about his ambitious plans for Standard Oil, Henry was all in. He was also just as religious, disciplined, and determined as John. In fact, perhaps their only difference was that Henry was even more ruthless in business. Henry approached business the same way he would approach war. The only way to win was to completely destroy your enemy, and so John adopted this philosophy as well. You see, competition in oil refining was quickly turning warlike. Now that others had figured out how simple the refining process really was, Rockefeller's product was no longer unique. New brands of kerosene were popping up all over the market. So John and Henry began scheming and decided to form strategic alliances that would not only boost Standard Oil's profits, but also hurt their competitors at the same time. One example was when John secretly colluded with railroads to get better transportation costs than all their rivals. At the time, oil was moved from place to place by an extensive train network dominated mostly by three railroad companies: the New York Central, the Erie, and the most powerful company in America at the time, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Because of how their routes were laid out, it was beneficial for the New York Central and Erie railroads to carry oil to refineries in Cleveland. But for the Pennsylvania Railroad, it was more profitable to carry oil directly to New York City or Philadelphia. So the Pennsylvania Railroad declared that Cleveland would be wiped out as a refining center, and they pulled out of the city completely. After this news that the largest railroad was leaving the city, many refineries in Cleveland left too. This was a disaster for the New York Central and Erie railroads, who had made sizable investments in Cleveland and were now losing customers. So, instead of joining the panicking crowd and leaving Cleveland, John saw that the Erie and New York Central railroads were in dire need of business, and he decided to use their desperation to his advantage. In exchange for a steady flow of oil through their networks, John negotiated a deal with the Erie in which Standard Oil would get a 75% discount on the railroad's official shipping costs. And in exchange for a daily order of 60 carloads of refined oil, John negotiated another deal with the New York Central Railroad to pay $1.65 per barrel shipped, when the official rate was $2.40. So with both railroads, John now had extremely favorable rates secured. And even though the railroads were reluctant to accept these lower prices, the guaranteed consistent shipments were irresistible to them. In fact, since these railroads went from shipping all sorts of things to focusing just on oil, they could simplify their operations and boost their profits. So it was win-win for everyone. Well, except for the Pennsylvania Railroad and Standard Oil's competitors. Because of the deal, Cleveland became the largest refining center in the country, and since the Pennsylvania Railroad had abandoned the city, it was at a steep disadvantage when trying to revive its business there. And of course, the discounts John had negotiated with the railways, known as railroad rebates, were kept secret from Standard Oil's competitors, so all the other oil businesses had to pay full price to transport their oil on the very same trains. And here's the thing. Because John knew for a fact that his costs were now lower than all his competitors, he was able to trigger a price war. John would lower the price of his oil so that his competitors had to do the same to stay competitive. But since John knew his competitors were paying more than him to transport oil, and thus at higher costs, even if they charged the same price, John was still making more profit. He knew his competitors wouldn't survive. So John kept slashing prices, and eventually the price would go so low that some competitors would go bankrupt. Once they went bust, Standard Oil would have way less competition, so John could bump up the price again and charge even more than he did originally. It was brutal, but extremely effective. Now, John knew railroad rebates were morally questionable. They give larger businesses hugely preferential treatment over smaller ones. However, it would be over a decade before any antitrust laws were passed to prevent these kinds of monopolistic practices, so legally, John wasn't doing anything wrong. And thus, in the meantime, this warlike strategy to crush competitors was paying off, and Standard Oil raked in enormous profits. However, there was one major problem. The massive surplus of oil meant oil prices had fallen as low as $2.40 per barrel, and as more and more oil fields were found in Pennsylvania, it seemed prices would continue to fall. The remaining competition was barely hanging on. In fact, John estimated that around 90% of oil refiners were actually losing money. But John began to fear that his individual success could be overshadowed by a total collapse of the entire oil industry. John was convinced that if they were facing a system-wide problem, they needed a system-wide solution. And John's solution would be to organize an even more dominant monopoly, the likes of which had never been seen before. By 1872, John and Henry were ruthlessly expanding Standard Oil, but oil prices had dropped another 25%. They knew if they didn't do something soon, the entire industry could collapse, and they would fall right along with it. So John decided to collaborate with the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Tom Scott. John and Scott had been rivals after the deal John made with the other two main railroads. But now Scott was reaching out to make a similar secret deal that was even more ambitious and ruthless. Scott proposed a secret alliance between the largest railroads and a very select group of the largest refiners, which of course included Rockefeller. And thus, Standard Oil and the Pennsylvania, New York Central, and Erie Railroads all formed an alliance together under the inconspicuous name of the South Improvement Company, or SIC for short. The deal was that in exchange for a secret 50% rebate on transportation costs, John would transport all his oil exclusively through these railroads. But John wasn't content with just getting benefits for himself. He designed the deal to be devastating for his competition. For example, whenever anyone outside this secret alliance transported kerosene through these railroads, Standard Oil would receive a 50% rebate from the cost of their shipments as well. These were known as drawbacks, and they meant that Standard Oil's competitors would not only be paying higher prices to transport their oil on the same railroads, but some of that money would be going directly to Rockefeller. And to top it all off, the railroads would even secretly give John detailed information about their competitors' shipments. He would know every detail of his rivals' businesses, and so he could undercut them by selling kerosene for cheaper prices. Anyone outside this secret alliance stood no chance. It was a death sentence for anyone excluded from the club, and the worst part was, they didn't even know it. However, while many of Rockefeller's critics called this whole arrangement a shameless power grab, to John, he truly believed it was the best way to save the oil industry. Because as things stood with so many competitors, their product was getting closer and closer to being given away for free, given the massive supply of oil available. He believed wiping out those smaller refiners would help the oil industry overall. But either way, it didn't matter, because rumors of a railroad and refiner cartel soon began to spread. When people read in the newspapers that the rates for the three most important railroads in the country had doubled overnight, they knew exactly who to blame. Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil. As rumors of the alliance continued to spread, thousands of people took to the streets in protest, threatening Standard Oil and the Pennsylvania Railroad with violence, vandalism, and arson. Protesters hijacked Standard's shipments and spilled their oil, and they tore up the Pennsylvania's train tracks from the ground. But the final blow to the SIC came when the oil miners made their countermove and boycotted the SIC. Without a supply of crude oil, John's refineries were useless, so 2 months after it was formed, the SIC was disbanded. It was a humiliating event, one that brought a lot of negative attention onto John. But John wasn't fazed by it. He simply decided that if he couldn't control the oil industry through shady backroom deals, then he would do it in public and conquer the industry by force. John wanted to bring as many refineries under Standard Oil as he could, and to his surprise, the SIC fiasco had actually caused one important change in the industry. Despite the very public fallout of the SIC alliance, there were still whispers of a secret railroad and refiner cartel, with many people paranoid that there must still be some kind of secret deal in place between the big railroads and the big refiners. Even though there wasn't, the rumor spread everywhere. Oil refiners were scared that if Standard Oil still had a secret deal with the railroads, they would get crushed. And John decided to leverage this threat to his advantage. In a period of 6 weeks, now known as the Cleveland Massacre, John managed to intimidate 22 out of the 26 oil refining companies in Cleveland into selling out for fractions of what their businesses were actually worth. So even though the SIC hadn't gone ahead, the fear it had created pressured many refiners into panic selling their companies to John. Plus, since many other refiners were losing money anyway, John would show them his company's finances so they could see how well Standard was doing, and to prove that he could outlast them all. For most refiners, the choice between fighting a losing battle and cashing out was obvious. And whenever anyone sold out, John gave them only 2 options. They could either sign a damning contract prohibiting them from ever joining the industry again, or they could join Standard Oil. Since most competitors chose to join Standard, John had the brightest minds in the industry working for him. All those entrepreneurs who'd been running their own companies were now brought under the Standard Oil umbrella into one giant company. Also, when new refineries came under Standard's ownership, they outfitted them with the latest oil refining technology, which drastically cut costs. By mid-1873, John was in control of an empire with a growing number of highly efficient refineries that together could ship out over 1 million barrels of kerosene every year. He now had a monopoly over the Cleveland refineries. However, on September 18, 1873, a day historians call Black Thursday, a series of bank failures plunged the U.S. economy into a national recession that lasted 6 years. For the first time, oil prices dropped not because there was too much supply, but instead because of a total lack of demand. Standard began operating only 2 of their 6 main refining plants in Cleveland. And a year after Black Thursday, a single oil barrel traded for as little as 48 cents, less than the cost of an equal amount of water. So everyone from the miners to the railroads to the refiners dreaded their seemingly inevitable fate, bankruptcy. But thanks to Standard Oil's careful management of finances, excellent credit with banks, and their modernized refineries, John was one of the only refiners in the country who could still turn a profit. And as always, John regarded every crisis as an opportunity. He smelled blood in the water. By then, John already dominated Cleveland, which was one of the main refining centers in the country. But he knew the bleak economic conditions were a nationwide problem, and so refiners in other refining centers like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York were all struggling badly. And thus, John decided this was precisely the right time to acquire as many of them as he could. So John initiated a nationwide buyout campaign, and whenever anyone was reluctant to sell out, John would resort to indirect ways of pressuring them into submission. For example, He would buy all the available refining machinery and barrels, so competitors couldn't even make or package their oil. And if somehow they managed to make any oil, he would reserve every railroad for months, so they couldn't ship it anywhere. Another one of John's brutal business tactics was to pressure the railroads to raise prices for other refiners high enough that they would soon face bankruptcy. Since he had detailed records of all his competitors' shipments, he waited for them to be on the verge of ruin, and then he would offer to save their business by buying them up for pennies. Eventually, everyone who Standard Oil wanted to acquire was either absorbed into the growing giant or crushed under its pressure. By the time the economy was starting to recover, Standard controlled over half of Pittsburgh's refining capacity, the largest refineries in Philadelphia, and secured a dominant position in New York as well. To exert even more control over the industry, John built a network of pipelines that brought crude oil into their refineries and pumped out refined oil in large cities. The pipelines meant Standard relied less on the railroads to transport their oil, and thus further reduced their unit costs. And with its pipelines covering the eastern seaboard of the United States like tentacles, Standard Oil earned its appropriate nickname, the Octopus. Despite still being only in his 30s, John D. Rockefeller was now the undisputed king of oil refining and one of the wealthiest men in the country. However, by now too many people had been victims of Standard Oil's predatory business practices. The largest newspaper in America at the time even called the company the most cruel, impudent, pitiless, and grasping monopoly that ever fastened upon a country. John's list of enemies was growing dangerously long. For the railroad companies, the oil industry was a tremendous source of business, as miners needed to get oil from wells to refineries, and refiners then needed to get it to big cities. However, when Standard Oil began laying a vast network of pipelines all across America's eastern shore, the railroad companies were faced with the fact that one of their most important customers was making them obsolete. So Tom Scott, the owner of the Pennsylvania Railroad, decided to lay his own pipelines, but he also did something he knew John wouldn't like. He started building his own oil refineries. Now Scott was in direct competition with John, so John interpreted this as a declaration of war. He decided to launch an all-out attack against America's most powerful company. First, John canceled all his business with the Pennsylvania Railroad and redirected all that oil to other railroads instead. Then John lowered the price of Standard Oil kerosene, which meant competitors' rivals had to do the same, thus reducing their profit margins and decreasing their shipment orders on the Pennsylvania Railroad. And finally, John convinced the New York Central and Erie railroads to lower their shipping fees drastically for everyone, to make sure the Pennsylvania Railroad lost even more business. These strategies most definitely worked. To compete, the Pennsylvania Railroad literally had to pay refiners to transport oil for them. Scott also had to lay off hundreds of his employees and reduce the salaries of those who stayed by 20%. But John's attack didn't just affect the Pennsylvania Railroad. Another big railroad, the B&O, had to make similar layoffs and wage cuts, and thus, John's attack on the Pennsylvania Railroad inadvertently caused one of the most violent labor strikes in American history. Dozens of people died in the commotion, and in Pittsburgh alone, the Pennsylvania Railroad lost 500 freight cars, 120 locomotives, and 27 buildings after they were torched by protesters. Even John started to get concerned by the chaos unfolding. Before long, the Pennsylvania Railroad, a Goliath once thought invincible, had lost the battle against Standard Oil, and Tom Scott was more than ready to surrender. Scott was in a desperate position, and John's business partner Henry, who saw business as war, saw this as an opportunity to crush him totally. But John had a better idea. and instead moved to coordinate a massive deal with the railroads. John agreed to help the Pennsylvania Railroad survive by guaranteeing 47% of standard traffic to them. The New York Central, the Erie, and the B&O got the rest. In exchange for the steady source of shipments, John demanded a very large secret rebate on the Pennsylvania's official rates. He demanded even more detailed information about their competitors' shipments, and he wanted 20 cents for every single barrel that passed through any of the railroads as well. Much of this was similar to the secret alliance proposed before, but this time John was the one who held the balance of power and could demand whatever he wanted. The railroads had little choice, and thus, this deal effectively made John one of the most powerful men in America. John basically now owned the railroads. He essentially controlled the oil industry and had an all-seeing eye into every one of his competitors. He completely dominated Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, and there were only a few scattered refineries in New York left standing outside his grip. Standard Oil was now in control of almost 90% of the entire oil refining industry, and Rockefeller's shadow empire was officially absolute. Winning the war was one thing. Keeping the empire intact? That was another battle entirely. You see, Rockefeller had a headache. A legal one. The state of Pennsylvania had passed laws making it illegal for a company based in another state to own property within its borders. And since Standard Oil was chartered in Ohio, that meant technically, John couldn't directly own his refineries in Philadelphia, his pipelines in Pittsburgh, or his storage tanks in Erie. The man who had conquered an entire industry was being stopped by a piece of paper. If he couldn't find a way around this, his empire would be forced to operate as a collection of separate, uncoordinated pieces. And that would mean chaos. Higher costs, rivals sneaking back in through the cracks. So Rockefeller called on his secret weapon, a lawyer named Samuel Dodd. Dodd was a quiet, thoughtful man. He didn't look like a revolutionary. But what he handed Rockefeller in 1882 would change the course of American business forever. He called it the Standard Oil Trust. Here's how it worked. Instead of Standard Oil directly owning all those out-of-state properties, a small group of trustees, 9 men, including Rockefeller himself, would hold the stock of every single subsidiary company in their name. These 9 men controlled everything. The refineries, the pipelines, the railroads, the barrels, the export terminals. Legally, each subsidiary was independent, but operationally, they were all puppets, and the 9 men held the strings. Think of it like a pyramid. At the bottom were dozens of companies. Above them, the trust, and at the very top, one man, John D. Rockefeller. The public didn't fully understand what had just happened, but Rockefeller's competitors did, and they were horrified. The trust was a loophole so elegant, so devastating, that it effectively rendered state anti-monopoly laws useless. Standard Oil wasn't just a company anymore. It was a shadow empire, legally bulletproof and tighter than ever before. By 1884, the trust controlled 90% of America's refining capacity and was rapidly buying up pipelines, storage facilities, and even lumber forests to make its own barrels. John wasn't just the king of oil. He was the king of the entire supply chain. But just as he reached the peak of his power, a threat emerged from an entirely unexpected direction. Not from a rival oilman, not from a railroad baron, from an inventor in New Jersey, a man named Thomas Edison. In 1879, Thomas Edison had demonstrated something miraculous. A small glass bulb with a carbon filament that glowed for 40 hours without burning out. Within a few years, he had improved it to over 1,200 hours. Arc lighting was already illuminating city streets. But Edison's incandescent bulb was different. It was safe. It was reliable. It could light a single room in a private home. And it didn't need kerosene. This was the first real threat to Rockefeller's empire. For decades, kerosene had been the only practical way to light a home after dark. Millions of families around the world depended on it. But now, electricity was coming. And if Edison succeeded, Rockefeller's entire fortune could evaporate. Imagine the pressure. You've spent 20 years building the most powerful monopoly the world has ever seen. You've crushed every rival, bribed every politician, outsmarted every railroad. And now, a man with a glass bulb and a copper wire might render your entire industry obsolete. Most executives would have panicked. They would have slashed prices, sold off assets, tried to squeeze every last dollar before the end. But Rockefeller didn't panic. He did something far more dangerous. He watched, he waited, and he prepared. Because John had noticed something that Edison hadn't fully grasped yet. Electricity was impressive, but in 1885, most of America was still rural. Farms, small towns, isolated homesteads stretched across the prairies. Stringing electrical wires to every one of them was impossibly expensive. It would take decades. Kerosene, on the other hand, could be delivered in a can by horse and wagon. It was portable. It was cheap, and for the foreseeable future, it was still necessary. So Rockefeller didn't fight electricity head-on. He simply made kerosene cheaper, cleaner, and more widely available than ever before. He expanded Standard Oil's global reach into China, India, Japan, Africa. By 1890, Standard was selling more kerosene overseas than in America. The company had become a global machine. But even as he held off the electric threat, Rockefeller knew something else was brewing. A new technology was emerging, one that would not only save his empire, but multiply its value beyond anything he had ever imagined. The internal combustion engine. Here's an irony that history doesn't often mention. For decades, gasoline was considered a useless byproduct of refining kerosene. It was volatile, smelly, dangerous. Refiners literally dumped it into rivers or burned it off in giant flares just to get rid of it. Rockefeller's own chemists had studied gasoline and dismissed it as a waste product. Something you couldn't sell. Something you couldn't even give away. But then, in the 1880s and 90s, a series of inventors in Germany and France began experimenting with something called the automobile. And those noisy, sputtering machines didn't run on kerosene. They ran on gasoline. At first, nobody took it seriously. Cars were toys for the rich. Unreliable, expensive, and impractical. But Rockefeller, as always, was watching the numbers. And the numbers told a strange story. Gasoline demand, tiny as it was growing. Slowly at first, then faster. By 1900, there were about 8,000 cars in America. By 1905, there were 78,000. By 1910, nearly 500,000. And every single one of them needed gasoline. Overnight, the worthless byproduct became the most valuable liquid on Earth. Standard Oil, which had spent decades building the most efficient refining system in history, was suddenly sitting on a gold mine. While smaller refiners scrambled to retool their operations, Standard simply turned a valve. The gasoline that once flowed into rivers now flowed into fuel tanks. And the profits were staggering. Between 1900 and 1910, Standard Oil's net profits more than doubled. John D. Rockefeller, now technically retired and spending most of his time on his New York estate, watched his personal fortune swell to previously unimaginable heights. But there was a problem. A very wealthy, very stubborn problem with a Scottish accent. Andrew Carnegie. The feud between Rockefeller and Carnegie had been simmering for years. Ever since Carnegie blamed Rockefeller for the death of his mentor, Tom Scott. But by the late 1890s, the rivalry had shifted from personal bitterness to something far more dangerous. A direct collision of empires. Carnegie dominated steel. Rockefeller dominated oil. For years, their industries didn't overlap. But then Rockefeller made a move that Carnegie saw as a declaration of war. He invested heavily in the Mesabi Iron Range in Minnesota, the largest deposit of high-grade iron or ever discovered in North America. Carnegie needed that iron for his steel mills. And now, Rockefeller owned it. Imagine the tension. two of the wealthiest, most ruthless men in American history, circling each other like heavyweight boxers. Carnegie had the steel mills. Rockefeller had the raw materials. Neither could fully win. Neither could afford to lose. For months, they refused to speak. Their lieutenants negotiated through intermediaries, each side trying to gain leverage. Carnegie reportedly said he wouldn't set foot in the same room as Rockefeller. Rockefeller, for his part, stayed silent. He didn't need to threaten. He just needed to wait. Because Carnegie had a weakness. He was getting old, and he was tired of fighting. In 1901, Carnegie finally blinked. He agreed to sell his entire steel empire to a banker named J.P. Morgan for $480 million. It was the largest business deal in American history. And here's where Rockefeller got his revenge. Morgan's new company, U.S. Steel, needed iron ore. Lots of it. And Rockefeller controlled the Mesabi Range. So Rockefeller sold his iron ore holdings to Morgan as well, for $88.5 million in U.S. Steel stock, which then skyrocketed in value. Carnegie, who had hoped to walk away as the undisputed king of American industry, suddenly found himself looking up at Rockefeller's net worth. The oil man had won again. But this time, the victory came with a cost. Because while the billionaires were busy fighting each other, the American public was growing angrier. And they were about to find their champion, a woman named Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell had a very personal reason to hate John D. Rockefeller. When she was a young girl, her father had been an oil refiner in Pennsylvania. He was a small, honest businessman, and Rockefeller had destroyed him, not through fair competition, through railroad rebates, predatory pricing, and secret deals that her father could never match. Her family lost everything. They never recovered, and Ida never forgot. By 1902, Tarbell was a journalist for McClure's magazine, one of the most influential publications in America, and she proposed a series of articles about Standard Oil. Not a puff piece, not a balanced overview, an expose, a methodical, documented, page-by-page destruction of Rockefeller's reputation. She spent nearly 2 years researching. She interviewed hundreds of witnesses, former competitors, railroad executives, politicians who had taken bribes. She pored over court records, shipping manifests, and hidden contracts. And piece by piece, she assembled the true story of Standard Oil. The secret rebates, the drawbacks, the pipeline wars, the Cleveland massacre, the bribed legislators, the ruined families. When the first article appeared in McClure's in November 1902, America was stunned. People had known Rockefeller was ruthless, but they hadn't known the half of it. Tarbell's writing was factual, precise, and devastating. She didn't need to exaggerate. The truth was damning enough. She wrote about Rockefeller's father, Devil Bill, and his double life. She exposed the sexual assault accusation that had forced the family to flee. She revealed the second marriage and the abandoned family. For the first time, the public saw not just the monopoly, but the man behind it. And they didn't like what they saw. Rockefeller, for his part, refused to respond. He told his family to ignore the articles. He told his executives to say nothing. He believed that silence was the best defense. But it wasn't. His silence was interpreted as guilt. The more Tarbell wrote, the angrier the public became. And then, a new enemy emerged from the political arena. A man who saw in Standard Oil the perfect target to launch his own legacy. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was not a subtle man. He was a cowboy, a hunter, a war hero. And he hated monopolies with a burning passion. He believed that men like Rockefeller and Carnegie had grown too powerful, that they had corrupted the American dream, that they answered to no law and no democracy, and he was determined to stop them. In 1901, Roosevelt became president after the assassination of William McKinley. And almost immediately, he turned his sights on Standard Oil. He didn't just want to punish Rockefeller. He wanted to destroy the entire trust system. He called them the most dangerous of all conspiracies. But Roosevelt was smart. He knew he couldn't just declare war on Standard Oil without evidence. So his administration launched the most aggressive antitrust investigation in American history. They subpoenaed documents. They deposed executives. They traced every secret deal, every hidden pipeline, every railroad rebate. And in 1906, they filed a massive federal lawsuit against Standard Oil of New Jersey, the holding company at the heart of Rockefeller's trust. The lawsuit was staggering. Over 12,000 pages of evidence. More than 400 witnesses. The federal government charged Standard with 1,700 separate violations of antitrust law. Rockefeller, now in his late 60s, was called to testify. And the transcripts reveal a man who was both defiant and evasive. Again and again, he claimed he couldn't remember. He couldn't recall specific meetings. He had no knowledge of secret deals. His memory, somehow, failed him at every critical question. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from around the world watched as the world's richest man squirmed under oath. But Rockefeller never broke. He never admitted wrongdoing. He never apologized. The trial dragged on for years. Roosevelt left office in 1909, but his successor, William Howard Taft, continued the fight. And finally, on May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States delivered its verdict. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously. Standard Oil was a monopoly. It had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it had 180 days to dissolve itself into separate, independent companies. The news exploded across the country. Headlines screamed, "Rockefeller defeated. Trust buster wins. Empire falls." Ida Tarbell called it a victory for democracy. Theodore Roosevelt declared it a triumph of law over greed. The American people celebrated. They believed they had finally brought down the great monster of Standard Oil. And John D. Rockefeller? He was playing golf. When a reporter rushed to tell him the news, Rockefeller reportedly said nothing. He finished his swing, watched the ball arc down the fairway, and then quietly replied, "Is that so? Well, are you going to sell your Standard Oil stock? Because I'm not." And here is the great irony of John D. Rockefeller's career. The breakup of Standard Oil didn't make him poorer. It made him richer. Much, much richer. Here's why. When Standard Oil was broken into 34 separate companies, what we now know as ExxonMobil, Chevron, Marathon, Amoco, Conoco, and others, Rockefeller still owned roughly 25% of the original trust. That meant he received proportional shares in every single one of the new companies. And those shares, now traded publicly for the first time, soared in value. Investors realized that each of these new companies was leaner, more aggressive, and operating in a booming market. Gasoline demand was exploding. The automobile was no longer a luxury. It was a necessity. Within 2 years of the breakup, Rockefeller's personal net worth had nearly tripled. In 1916, at the age of 77, John D. Rockefeller became the world's first documented billionaire. Think about that. The government tried to destroy his empire, and instead, they made him exponentially wealthier. The man who had been vilified as the face of corporate greed was now richer than any human being in recorded history. But by then, Rockefeller had stopped caring about the money. He had a new mission, one that would ultimately define his legacy as much as Standard Oil ever did. In the final decades of his life, John D. Rockefeller transformed himself. The ruthless predator who had crushed competitors and bribed politicians became a philanthropist, and not a casual one. A systematic, obsessive, business-like philanthropist. He approached giving away money the same way he had approached making it, with discipline, efficiency, and scale. He hired Frederick Gates, a former Baptist minister, to manage his charitable giving. Together, they created the Rockefeller Foundation. And over the next 25 years, John gave away more than $500 million. He funded the University of Chicago, transforming it from a small Baptist college into a world-class research institution. He created Rockefeller University in New York, which has produced more than 20 Nobel Prize winners. He poured millions into medical research, leading to breakthroughs in hookworm, yellow fever, and meningitis. During World War I, he spent millions on war relief. During the Great Depression, he funded housing projects and job training. By the time he died, Rockefeller had given away more money than any private individual in history. But the question remains, did that erase the harm he caused? Can a man destroy thousands of businesses, ruin countless families, and then buy redemption with a few charitable donations? Rockefeller himself seemed to struggle with that question. In his final years, he became obsessed with living to be 100. He followed a strict diet. He exercised daily. He wore a wig to hide his baldness and dressed in brightly colored suits to appear younger. He wanted more time, not for money, for something else, perhaps for peace. On May 23, 1937, John D. Rockefeller died in his sleep at his estate in Ormond Beach, Florida. He was 97 years old, just 3 years short of his goal. At his funeral, the minister said, "He gave away a fortune, but more than that, he gave away his heart." But Ida Tarbell, who outlived him by 7 years, never forgave him. In her final writings, she said, "He was the greatest man I ever knew, and the worst." So what do we make of John D. Rockefeller? There is no simple answer. He was a poor boy who worked harder than anyone around him. A devoted husband and father who never drank, never smoked, never cheated on his wife. A pious Baptist who gave Sunday school lessons while secretly orchestrating the destruction of entire industries. He was also a liar, a briber, a predator who used fear and economic violence to crush anyone who stood in his way. He didn't just beat his competitors, he annihilated them. Then he offered to buy their ruins for pennies on the dollar. But without him, the modern oil industry might not exist. Without his obsession with efficiency, gasoline might have remained too expensive for automobiles. Without his philanthropic millions, universities and medical research might have been delayed by decades. He was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was something far more complicated. He was a force of nature. And forces of nature don't ask for permission. John D. Rockefeller once wrote his own epitaph. It's not on his grave, but it should be. He said, "I have made many mistakes, but I have never been idle. I have never been selfish, and I have never been satisfied." Because for Rockefeller, enough was never enough. Not money, not power, not time. And maybe that's his real legacy. Not the billions, not the monopoly, not the philanthropy, but the restless, relentless, unforgiving drive of a man who started with nothing and refused to stop until he had everything. And even then, he kept going.